I'd like to welcome everyone back after our brief break to Mishnah Zevachim with Rabbi Walfish. It's the third in our Mishnah in Depth series, sponsored in the memory of Rifka Rosenwein by her family. We're glad to be back with Rabbi Walfish as we continue through Zevachim following the Mishnah Yomit schedule. Sources for today's class will be posted in chat once things get underway. With that, I'm going to hand things over.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. Thanks for everyone for participating. Let's just review where we are. We have a lot of material to cover since last week was Tisha B'Av, and we were otherwise occupied. So we basically have most of 4 prakim to cover this week. So I'm not sure we'll cover all of it, but we'll try to cover at least most of it, and maybe we'll make up some of that next week. So we're starting with last week's 2 prakim, which are prakim 5 and 6, chapters 5 and 6. Just to get us oriented, let's review the first 4 chapters, which form a unit within Masechet Zevachim. Okay, and so I have here on share screen, you'll see that there's an anaphora, that's parallels between beginnings of chapters 1 through 4. They all open with the word kol, and the first 2 actually open with kol hazvachim. Then what is more dramatic is the epiphora, parallels among chapter endings within this section. Each one of the 4 chapters ends with a unit that contains the word machshava, thought, or probably more accurately, planning. Okay, mental planning. What makes this particularly interesting is that the word machshava, while it's a central theme in the first 4 chapters, the word itself actually appears, with one exception, only in the chapter endings. One exception is the beginning of chapter 3. Okay, as you can see here on the chart. Okay, Mishnah 1, chapter 3, and Mishnah 1, it also appears. That's in the parentheses, but more to the point is it closes each one of the chapters, and that weaves together these 4 chapters around the theme of thinking, planning, and that indeed is the subject of the first 4 chapters. Okay, the guiding theme of the first 4 chapters is ways in which sacrifices can be derailed by improper thoughts. I use the word derailed rather than disqualified because the main topic, which occupies chapters 2, 3, and most of 4, is when, and you can see it here on the chart, when you have thoughts of chutz lizmano or chutz limkomo. Chutz lizmano, otherwise known as pigul, okay, which means abomination. You render the sacrifice an abomination when you plan to eat it or offer the imurim, the inner parts that are for almost all korbanot are brought on the mizbeach, or to throw the blood at the wrong time. So it's beyond the allotted time frame. Okay, that's called chutz lizmano. That not only disqualifies the sacrifice, but it renders it pigul, it renders it an abomination. And anyone who will consume any part of that korban will have the penalty of karet. And also chutz limkomo, which is also a very serious infraction, but it doesn't carry with it the penalty of karet. Okay, he plans to do one of the above in the wrong place, outside of the precincts of the temple. Okay, so that machshava, actually, these two kinds of machshava, improper machshava, disqualify the sacrifice. But the kind that's described in chapter 1 is shelo lishma. Okay, it's to have the intent for the wrong kind of sacrifice. I'm bringing a chatat and I intend an olah. I'm bringing an olah, I intend a chatat, or any other combo of those. In most of those cases, the Mishnah says, it doesn't disqualify the korban, but it derails it in the sense that lo alul ba'alim l'shem chova. Okay, the person who brought it did not discharge his obligation. In other words, it's as though a sacrifice was offered, okay, and it's a valid sacrifice, and somehow or other, Am Yisrael, the temple, the Kohanim, get brownie points for offering a sacrifice, but the individual who brought it, it's as though he's out of the picture, because his obligation was not fulfilled. He will have to bring another sacrifice in its place. That's also derailed in a less far-reaching sense, with the exception of two sacrifices that are completely derailed, that are completely disqualified, chatat and korban pesach. Those are the two exceptions, and for them, if they're not brought with the intent of treating them as chatat or korban pesach, then they are completely disqualified. Okay, and finally, we saw that these 4 chapters are also bookended by an inclusio, parallels between the beginning of chapter 1 and the end of chapter 4. Okay, the notion of shelo lishman recurs at the end of chapter 4, when we're told that you have to, that ab initio, you have to bring the sacrifice with the 6 different intentions, l'shem, each one called l'shem. And some of those are directly relevant to the concept of shelo lishman, which takes up chapter 1. We saw some other parallels as well, but this is all just for the sake of review. So we'll leave this for the time being. That's just to remind us that the first 4 chapters form a unit. Okay, and now the part that will concern us is begins with chapter 5.
Can I ask you a short question?
Yes, for sure.
Pigul is chutz lizmano and notar is chutz limkomo, or it's
No.
not differentiated like
No.
that?
That's not the differentiation. Notar and pigul are related, but notar means when you
Leftover.
actually left it over. Pigul means when you did one of the required services, namely the services involving the blood, starting with shchita, then kabbalah, receiving the blood, holacha, taking the
Zrika,
blood
the 4
towards the
things.
mizbeach, and that's at the end of chapter 1, and finally the zrika itself. You do any of those with the intention of doing another part of the service beyond the appropriate time, that immediately disqualifies the sacrifice. Then it doesn't matter whether you leave it over or not. Okay, it's already disqualified. Okay, that's pigul. Okay, notar is I did everything with the proper intent, and then I ran overtime. Okay, I miscalculated how much I can eat per day. I thought I had more guests coming, whatever it is, and then I get down to the wire and I can't finish it. and then it gets left over. That's called notar. And chutz limkomo is when you, again, not when I actually do one of the services outside of the temple. Okay, that's all. That also will disqualify the sacrifice. But chutz limkomo means I intend to do it. Okay, and then it's disqualified right off the bat. So much so that if I intend both chutz lizmano and chutz limkomo, it doesn't become pigul. Okay, because since chutz limkomo disqualified the sacrifice, I sort of discount the chutz lizmano aspect of it. Okay, so okay, so let's
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, let's look at chapter 5. We already mentioned chapter 5 as a chapter that we might have thought would open the entire discussion. Okay, it open Masechet Zevachim, because chapter 5 really gives you a rundown of all the sacrifices. Okay, it's really a wonderful introduction to Tractates Zevachim, which makes it all the more remarkable. The Tractates Zevachim opens with the first 4 chapters, apparently because the rabbis of the Mishnah wanted to give extra emphasis to this notion of proper intention and the consequences of improper intention. Okay, in other words, even before getting to what does one do with the sacrifices, the Mishnah wants us to know that the sacrifices have to have proper thoughts accompanying them. Okay, this, by the way, fits into a larger pattern in which the rabbis in many areas, the rabbis of late Second Temple, post Second Temple, that's the period that we're talking about here, the rabbis of the Mishnaic period, in a way, sometimes often follow the prophets. Okay, you have the Torah presenting certain laws, then you have prophets. If you think about what prophets have to say about sacrifices, there was this misconception that used to be very popular, that prophets were very down on sacrifices. They thought sacrifices were unnecessary. There are actually a couple of psukim that can be quoted, a pasuk in Yirmiyahu, a pasuk in Amos, that might be read as being opposed to the whole notion of sacrifices. That's pretty clearly not the correct reading of those psukim. And what is certainly the case is the vast majority of places where the prophets rail against sacrifices, it's not against the concept of sacrifices per se, but a wonderful example is, a very sad example, obviously, but a very illustrative example is the first chapter of Yeshayahu, which we read just before Tisha B'Av, just over a week ago. That's the Haftarah that we read, and Lama li rov sivchechem yomar Hashem. What do I need all of your sacrifices for? But if you look in context, he's not saying, I don't want your sacrifices. What he's saying is, I don't want your sacrifices when you're not worthy of bringing sacrifices. Okay, in other words, what the prophets are trying to do is to say, sacrifices are not some kind of ritual that you just have to perform. Sacrifices express a profound idea, a profound relationship between the one bringing the sacrifice and his God, right? That's what sacrifices are meant to represent. And when the person is leading an improper lifestyle, okay, so sacrifices can't paper that over. And that's when the prophet says, of what use to me are your sacrifices when you come to the temple, you fervently offer your sacrifices, and then you go home and you live as though God wasn't part of your lives at all. That's not what a sacrifice is designed to mean. Sacrifice is designed to mean something much more profound and something that has to really impact on the way in which you live your life. Okay, so that's a common theme that you find in the prophets. And then you find the rabbis, and this is very typical, translating that theological idea into halachic categories. And so now for the rabbis, the thoughts that accompany the sacrifices become an integral part of what sacrifices are all about. So the first 4 chapters, okay, precede, they come before chapter 5 gives us a rundown of the different sacrifices and what one does with them. Okay, and that 4-chapter introduction really hammers on the theme of what we have to have in our consciousness when we bring those sacrifices. Okay, and that's a very important axiological statement on the part of the rabbis. What's really important? Okay, now let's take a closer look at chapter 5. Okay, as I say, it's really a very, very central chapter, and in a very real sense, this is the opening chapter of Tractates Zevachim. You have a 4-chapter, let's call it introduction to Tractates Zevachim about the thoughts, and now we get into the nitty-gritty of the sacrifices themselves. Okay, now you'll note I build this as the hierarchy of sacrifices. Okay, and we'll see in a bit why it's clear that the Mishnah presents the sacrifices in a hierarchical structure. Okay, but before getting into that, it's very interesting to see how the Mishnah introduces the chapter. Ezehu mikoman shel zvachim. You notice I highlighted this word mikoman. What is the place of the sacrifices? I can imagine that if I were, presenting this chapter, I wouldn't ask necessarily what is the place of the sacrifices. I might say, what is the nature? What is the procedure? What is the ritual? These are all terms, can find Hebrew equivalents for all of these terms. What is the place of the sacrifices? That really gives an extremely important role to the place of sacrifices. Now let's trace that theme as we go through the chapter. Ezu mikoman shel zvachim, and the first thing that we're told, we start with Kodshei Kodashim, the Holy of Holies. So we already see something hierarchical here, right? We open with the holiest sacrifices, Kodshei Kodashim. And the first thing the Mishnah says about it is Chitatan Batzafon. Okay? They're slaughtered in the north. North meaning all of the slaughtering of sacrifices, the vast majority of sacrificial procedures took place inside the courtyard of the temple, the Azhara, which is the courtyard of the temple. So the northern part of that courtyard is where you have to slaughter the Kodshei Kodashim sacrifices. Let's jump down a bit to Kodashim Kalim. You see, there's this division. After Mishnah 5, you come to Mishnah 6, HaTodah ve'el Nazir, the Todah, the Thanksgiving offering, and the El Nazir, that's a Shlomim offering brought by the Nazir, the Nazirite, when he concludes his period of Nazirut. Those 2 korbanot are called Kodashim Kalim, and going down the line, all the rest of these are also Kodashim Kalim. Okay, so you start with Kodshei Kodashim, continue with Kodashim Kalim, and lo and behold, look at the Kodashim Kalim, Shchitatan B'chol Makom Ba'azara. The holiest sacrifices have to be slaughtered in the north. Okay? Now, and note Shchitatan Batzafon runs through all these mishnayot. I've marked it off in the yellow. Okay, through Mishnah Hey, all of them are Shchitatan Batzafon. When you get to Kodashim Kalim, Shchitatan B'chol Makom Ba'azara. They can be slaughtered anywhere in the courtyard. Now, what's special about the north? Okay, so those of you who remember the Haftarah at the beginning of the 3 weeks, okay, Mitzafon Tipatach Hara'ah. Yeah, but that's not the point here. Point here is we're in the temple. Okay, so to orient yourself in the temple, you have to remember that you're actually occidenting yourself. Okay, we orient ourselves because we are facing the Orient. Okay, I mean, since compasses have come into vogue, we always orient ourselves towards the north, right? Because the maps always have the north up on top, okay? Because compasses point north. The North Star helps us to navigate, right? So when we orient ourselves towards the north, it's easier for navigation. In the ancient world, we always oriented ourselves towards the Orient because that's where the sun rises, okay? But in the temple, you're actually occidenting yourself because you enter from the east. Sometimes you enter from the south, but let's assume for our purposes you enter from the east, and you keep going west. You go west until you hit the Azara. Then you go west in the Azara till you hit the Mizbeach. You continue west and you hit the Heichal, which is the temple structure itself. You continue west and you get to the Kodesh Kodashim, the Holy of Holies in the temple. It's all heading west. So if I'm entering the temple from the east, heading west, the north is on my right. The right in halakha is always the main direction, okay? And I apologize to any lefties who might be participating here, okay? And there are big questions that come up in halakha, whether in some areas of halakha, a lefty can't accomplish certain halachot. And for other halachot, we say his left hand is like everybody else's right hand. Okay, that's a big issue that comes up in halakha. Because halakha, by and large, okay, takes the right as the main, as the main direction. Okay, for example, we learned back in chapter 2 that the Kohen has to perform all of his avodot with his right hand. Which again raises the question, if there's a Kohen who's a lefty, does that mean he can't serve? Does that mean he serves with his left hand instead of his right hand? We're not going there. The Mishnah doesn't discuss that. We're not going there. But just, to be aware of the question. So the right is the key direction. And as a result, when you go into the temple, heading west, off to your right is the north. And for that reason, that's where the Kodshei Kodashim are all slaughtered.
The right is the default.
What? That's the default, but for Kodshei Kodashim. For other korbanot, the Kodashim Kalim, okay, that can be done anywhere in the Azara, and the practice developed to do it in the south. So you had this division. So here you have your hierarchy in terms of slaughtering. But as we go through the chapter, we'll see the main hierarchy that really gives us the whole system of sacrifices has to do with the blood work. And the blood work is really the most important part of the sacrifice as far as the rabbis are concerned. And I'll remind you of our introduction to the tractate, where we talked about how in the Torah, when the Torah presents the sacrifices, the impression that you get is the main nature of a sacrifice is determined by what happens to the body of the animal. Is the body of the animal offered whole on the altar? Is it burnt outside of the camp? Okay, is it mostly eaten by the Kohanim? Is it mostly eaten by the person who brings it and whomever he invites to join with him? That's what gives each korban its main definition, its main character in the Torah. Now, along with that, the Torah also designated what to do with the blood. By and large, the blood is sprinkled on the altar. That's in most cases. Okay, there are a couple of exceptions. We'll get to that in just a bit. And it can be offered in different ways. Okay, we'll see the different ways as we're going through, so I'm not going to detail them. That seems to be in the Torah less central. You see here in chapter 5 of Zevachim that for the rabbis, the main thing is the blood. And that gives you the hierarchy. And that already changes the nature of the hierarchy. Because if you look at the first sacrifices, Harvest Sa'ir Shel Yom Kippurim, followed by Parim Nisrafim Usirim Nisrafim, followed by Chatat. All of these are forms of Chatat offerings. On Yom Kippur, the Kohen, in order to enter the Holy of Holies, has to come in with the blood of the par and the sa'ir. The par is the bullock, is the Kohen Gadol's personal sin offering. The sa'ir is Am Yisrael's sin offering. And the blood of both of these korbanot is brought into the Holy of Holies. Okay, see that in line 3 here. Daman ta'un hazaya al bein habadim ve'al parochet ve'al mizbach hazahav. The blood is sprinkled between the carrying poles of the Aron. In the second temple, there was no Aron, and so it would be towards that place, okay, which is identified by the Mishnah as the Even Shtiyah, okay, the foundation stone, which most scholars identify with the Kaaba in the Al-Aqsa mosque in Yerushalayim, okay, on the Temple Mount. Okay, so we start off with the Chatat. Why? Because the Chatat has the most impressive blood work, right? Here the blood is brought all the way into the Holy of Holies, and then it's sprinkled in the Kodesh, in the Hechal, the Parochet, the Mizbach HaZahav, those are both in the Hechal. And similarly with Parim HaNisrafim, Sirim HaNisrafim, these are sin offerings of the community, not on Yom Kippur, for a specific sin. On Yom Kippur, it's on general principles. We assume that we all need atonement, and so we bring the sin offering. During the year, if we know of a particular communal sin, then we bring either a par or a sa'ir, and what happens to them is their bodies are burnt outside of the camp. Okay, so those are called parim nisrafim, usirim nisrafim. And what happens to the blood? A little less impressive than the Yom Kippur offerings. Here the blood is brought just on the parochet and Mizbach HaZahav. That happened on Yom Kippur as well, right? That's why you have the same color coding here. But Yom Kippur, first it was brought inside the Holy of Holies. And then you come to the regular chatat. Chatat hatzibur vayachid. They're chataot of the entire community. Those are standardized sacrifices on Rosh Chodesh and festivals. Okay, the Musaf offering included a shiur lechatat. Okay, that's called the chatat hatzibur, chatat hayachid for an individual sin. And here the blood is more standard. It's on the altar, but where on the altar? On the four horns, the very top of the altar. Okay, the structure of the altar is at the top of the altar. There are four horns at every corner. Okay, the horns extend up a cubit each, and the blood of the chatat is daubed on the four horns of the altar. So now what we've seen is when the Torah presents all the sacrifices, the first sacrifice the Torah opens with is the olah. Why does the olah head the list? Because of what happens to the animal, to the body of the animal. It's offered entire on the altar. It's all burnt on the altar. It's a gift to God. We approach God with a gift, with a tribute in the form of an olah. That opens the list in the Torah, both in chapter 1 and in chapter 6. Two different lists, both of them open with the olah offering, because the body of the korban determines its character. In the Mishnah, the list opens with the chatat offering, because the blood, what happens with the blood, determines the nature of the korban and the ranking of the korban. The chatat is at the top of the list. And we have three types of chatat in descending order: the blood that is brought into the Holy of Holies, the blood that is brought into the sanctuary but not into the Holy of Holies, and the blood that is brought to the very top of the altar and daubed on the horns of the altar. That opens the list. Notice this is also mikoman shel zvachim. We talked about two places: the place where you slaughter the animal, the place where the blood is brought. That gives you the hierarchy. And then we move down the list. The next on the list is the olah, slaughtered in the north, just like the chatat. Okay? But then the blood is two matanot, two placings of blood, which are four, meaning you place them on diagonally opposite corners, okay, but not on the horns of the altar. For the olah, the blood is actually on the bottom half of the altar, okay, and you don't daub it, you throw it, okay. You take the vessel with the blood and you throw the blood towards the wall of the altar on its lower part. So that's a lower level of sacrifice, because the blood doesn't go to the top of the altar. It doesn't get further in than the altar, like the regular chatat offering, and it doesn't even get to the top of the altar. Okay, it's thrown towards the wall of the altar. And this shtayim shein arba continues through the next levels. There is a certain kind of shlamim called shlamei tzibor. There's only one instance of that, and that is the shlamim offering on Shavuot that accompanies the 2 loaves of bread offering, the shtei halechem. Okay, the special shtei halechem offering on Shavuot, accompanied by a shlamim offering of of sheep. Okay, and those are called Zivchei Shlomei Tzibor and Asham. The Asham offering is a kind of sin offering, but a different kind. We can't go into how it differs from the Chatat, but its level is underneath the Olah. It's like the communal Shlomim, and they're still called Kodshei Kodashim. They're still Holy of Holies. Okay? Okay. And there's one final point that that also unites all of the Kodshei Kodashim. The main point that unites them is places. The Shechita has to be in the north, on the right. The blood is brought in a more dramatic place, especially for the Chatat, but for the Olah and the Shlomim as well. Okay? And finally, what characterizes Kodshei Kodashim is what happens to the body of the Korban. So the first two kinds of Chatat, Elu va'elu, meaning the Chataot of Mishnah Aleph and the Chataot of Mishnah Bet, Nisrafim beveit hadashen. They're burnt outside the camp. There's no part of the body of the animal makes it onto the altar. The blood gets all the way inside, but the body doesn't make it to the altar at all. Okay? If you can think of the blood, what does the blood symbolize? The Torah makes this clear. The blood is the life
Nefesh.
spirit.
The
Okay?
nefesh.
It's something you can't see. In other words, this is more of an ethereal korban. The body of the animal is almost secondary. You don't offer the body to God. And the body is not eaten by anyone. It's just burnt. Dispose of it. You have to dispose of it in a certain way, but basically it's just, let's not have it lying around. So we have a special incinerator to remove it from the world. The main thing is what I did with the blood. The regular chatat is already more balanced. The blood is already on the altar, but at the top of the altar, and this already is eaten inside the kla'im, meaning inside the temple precincts per se, the azara, okay, only for male priests, zichrei kahuna. They can't share it with anybody. Only priests who are officiating can consume this, which is another way of saying the eating is part of the service. The eating and the turning into smoke of parts of it on the altar and the eating by the priests complement one another. They go together. Okay? The olah, of course, is all burnt on the altar. And the other Kodshei Kodashim also are eaten inside the temple by the by the Kohen. And once again, the place is very crucial here, right? There's a special place for these korbanot to be eaten. So I think we're getting a clearer sense of why the opening line of the chapter is, what is the place of Zevachim? All of these are relaxed when we come to the Kodashim Kalim. Kodashim Kalim, anywhere inside the Azara, inside the temple courtyard is fine. The blood work is similar to the Olah and the Asham, okay? But what happens to the body of the animal? Ne'achalim b'chol ha'ir l'chol adam. You can go outside of the temple. It has to be inside the city of Yerushalayim, meaning inside the city walls. Okay? And who can eat it? Anyone can eat it. Person has to be pure. It's also sacred food, but this seems to be less of an integral part of the service. Okay, one Okay, now one point that will lead us into the chart that I'll show you presently. Notice that the opening of the chapter, the highest level sacrifice is the chatat. The lowest level is the Pesach. Does that jog anybody's memory? No? Okay, take a look at chapter 1. All of these Zvachim, kol ha-Zvachim shenizbechu shelo lishman ksherim, chutz min ha-Pesach u'min ha-Chatat. There are only two sacrifices that are completely disqualified by improper intent. And that's the Chatat. Okay, that's what I noted here with this line that links the Chatat, the three kinds of Chatat, to the Pesach. It's almost as though we're saying the Chatat at the top of the heap and the Pesach at the bottom of the heap. If you confuse them with any other sacrifice, you're out of bounds. That completely disqualifies the entire sacrifice. Okay, here's the parallel in chart form. Okay, the chatat here on the left and the three kinds of chatat here on the right, chapter 5. Pesach here on the right and the same Pesach here on the left. Okay, there's also a Mishnah at the beginning of chapter 1. There's an outlier view of what happens when you have improper intent, when you have a shelo lishman intent. This Shimon Achi Azariah says, well, it all depends. If you have an intention for a higher level sacrifice, that's okay. If you have an intention for a lower level sacrifice, that's a no-no. That will disqualify the sacrifice. And what he doesn't explain is, and then he explains, what do I mean by higher level and lower level? Well, you have Kodshei Kodashim and Kodashim Kalim. You have Bechor and Maaser and Shlamim. This is anticipating chapter 5. Okay, that's what this line of the chart is coming to show you. Okay, so it's interesting, although chapter 5 in a way is a kind of introduction, but these parallels show that even though chapter 5 is like a new introduction, but it's harking back to themes that were already presented in chapters 1 through 4, and particularly in chapter 1. Okay, so we can see how chapter 5 is, it's bringing us forward into the continuation of the tractate, but in a way, it's also linking us back with chapters 1 through 4. Okay, what I'd like to look at now, let's move into chapter 6. Okay, let's no. Okay, chapter 6 opens with a kind of appendix to chapter 5. Kodshei Kodashim sheshchatan b'rosh hamizbeach. We're still talking about place, and particularly place of slaughtering. And now, interestingly, you're sacrificing on the altar. I think, if you were to ask most people where are sacrifices slaughtered, probably most people would say on the altar. But that's not what we learned in chapter 5. Sacrifices are slaughtered in the courtyard, sometimes in the northern part of the courtyard and sometimes anywhere in the courtyard. So a sacrifice that can be offered anywhere in the courtyard, presumably the altar is standing in the middle of the courtyard, so you could slaughter those sacrifices there as well. But what about the sacrifices that have to be slaughtered in the north. Is the altar part of the north or not? So Rabbi Yossi Omer Kilu Nishchatu Batzafon. The entire altar is like the north, even though the altar sort of straddles north and south. Part of it is in the north. The altar was a huge, in rabbinic law anyway. If you've ever gone to see here in Israel, there are a couple of places. One of them, the northern part of Yam HaMelach, and one of them down in Timnah. You can see people who have made models of the Mishkan, and you'll see the altars they build are much, much smaller than the one that the rabbis describe. I describe a huge altar which straddles north and south. Okay, and Rabbi Yossi said it doesn't matter. The entire altar is like the north. Rabbi Yossi Bar Yudah Omer no, no, only the northern half of the altar is part of the north. Okay, so there's a kind of footnote to chapter 5. And then chapter 6 opens in earnest with Chatat Ha'of. There are only two kinds of bird offerings, the Chatat and the Olah. And here again, as with the animal offerings, the Chatat precedes the Olah. First we talk about the Chatat, and then we talk about the Olah. But that's in a way paradoxical because the Chatat and the Olah sort of switch roles in chapter 6, what we had in chapter 5. Because the Chatat, the blood is actually brought on the lower part of the altar, and for the Olah, it's brought on the upper part of the altar. Okay, we won't have a chance to try to examine what that might mean. Some scholars, Rav Hirsch, and more lately Professor Yoni Grossman, tried to analyze what that might mean. Milgram also has a discussion in his commentary to Vayikra, but that will take us too far afield. Okay, but what I think is worth noting is that you can see a lot of interesting parallels between chapters 2 and 6. As we go through the laws of the Chatat Ha'of and the Olat Ha'of in chapter 6, we'll hear a lot of echoes of chapter 2. Okay, so you have in chapter 2, anyone who does any of these 4 forms of service in order to eat something that is normally eaten, or to offer on the altar things that are normally burnt on the altar. Chutz limkomo, chutz lizmano, what are their laws? Same formulations in chapter 6 about the Chatat Ha'of and the Olat Ha'of. And here the parallel kinds of service to Shochet, Mekabel, Malech, and Zarek are Milakan and Mitzadaman. Milakan means instead of slaughtering the bird, okay, the neck of the bird is pierced with a thumbnail. Okay, Kohen had to have a long and sharp thumbnail, okay, that he would use, and from the back of the neck instead of from the throat. That's called malika. Mitzad daman, okay, the blood is squeezed out onto, it's not that much blood from the bird, and therefore you have to sort of squeeze the blood out of the bird on the altar. This is all in the Torah, so these are what are parallel to the services mentioned in chapter 2, and from then on it's essentially identical with chapter 2. Now, chapter 6 runs through the laws of if you have an improper intention, that will have the same ramifications for the bird as it had for the animal sacrifice. So basically, what chapter 6 is doing, the main thing chapter 6 is doing is recapping what was done in chapter 2 for animal sacrifices, and chapter 6 is recapping it for bird sacrifices. Okay, there's more in chapter 6, but we have 4 chapters to cover, so we don't have too much time to spend. Chapter 5, I think, was worthwhile to spend a good amount of time on. Chapter 6 and 7 will have to do a more cursory presentation. Okay, now chapter 7 continues chapter 6. We're still talking about the bird sacrifices. Okay, we let's just take a brief look at that here in yeah, here we go. Okay, this is chapter 7, Chatat Ha'ov Shasa Lemata Kemaseh Chatat L'Shem Chatat. The first Mishnah of chapter 7, in a way, weaves together the themes of chapter 1 and of chapter 6, because Shasa Lemata Kemaseh Chatat, that's all taken from chapter 6. Because what am I supposed to do to a chatat or to an olah? So I took the chatat and I do with it what I'm supposed to do for a chatat, l'shem chatat, sheira. Okay, I did everything right. But what if I do it kemaseh chatat, I do the actions of a chatat, but l'shem olah, I did it with the intention of an olah. That's already the theme of chapter 1, right? What happens when I offer a sacrifice with the wrong intention? I intend the wrong kind of sacrifice, or vice versa. Kemaseh olah l'shem chatat. Okay? So then, in all these cases, it's pasul. Remember, the chatat is completely disqualified when I have the wrong intention, right? And that is the introduction to what is a very interesting discussion a bit further on in the chapter. Okay, I'm not sure we'll be able to really, I mean, I am sure we will not be able to do justice to this conversation and its ramifications, but since it's a complicated discussion, I hope I'll be able to at least give you some of the basics of what it's about. Okay, the Mishnah then continues with the following question. Olata of shasa lemata kemaseh chatat l'shem chatat. I take an olah and I offer it. I do the work with it as though it were a chatat. The olah ta'of is supposed to be in the upper part of the altar, and instead I do it on the lower part of the altar. And I also do it l'shem chatat, with the intention of it being a chatat. So it's here I'm running together both disqualifications. I'm both doing the wrong thing with it and intending the wrong thing. And now the question is not, is this a valid sacrifice, but rather whether it's subject to mi'ilah. Is this subject to misappropriation? Okay. Now, in order to understand this, we need a bit of an introduction, and I don't know if we'll get much beyond the introduction today. But in order to understand what's happening in this Mishnah, okay, I'll give you the basics. Okay, how does mi'ilah work? Okay, things that are designated as sacrifices, and they're designated, this is my title, for divine quote-unquote consumption. Okay, these are sacrifices offered for God. They belong to God. If a person misappropriates them, uses one or another of these animals for his own personal use, then he has violated the transgression of milah with certain halachic consequences. He has to bring a sacrifice to atone for it. He has to replace it together with another. The Torah calls it a fifth. We would normally call it a fourth. 25% is called a fifth in halachic lingo. Okay, that's called me'ilah. Now, what happens with different sacrifices as far as me'ilah is concerned? So here you have an interesting differentiation between Kodshei Kodashim and Kodashim Kalim. Kodshei Kodashim, okay, now you'll notice I have two different columns here, before Zrikat Hadam, sprinkling the blood, and after. Zrikat Hadam is what permits the animal for whatever you're supposed to do with it. For burning it on the altar, for consumption of kohanim, consumption of individuals, whatever it is. That happens only after Zrikat Hadam. Before Zrikat Hadam, Kodshei Kodashim universally have me'ilah, because the definition of Kodshei Kodashim is the animal is designated for God, even if part of it is consumed. Now, for Kodshei Kodashim, as we learned in chapter 5, whatever part is consumed only by priests. That's part of the service. That means it's all for God. The Kohanim are God's representatives. They're his emissaries. God says, I'll take part of it on my altar, and my Kohanim will eat the rest. So all of it has gone to God. That is what happens with Kodshei Kodashim. So they all have me'ilah before Zrikat Hadam. Kodashim Kalim, by definition, means the sacrifice is oriented not only for God, but for man as well. Man will eat it, and not only Kohanim, and not only inside the temple. And that means there is no me'ilah. When the sacrifice is designated, there is no me'ilah. What happens after the blood has been sprinkled? So for Kodashim Kalim, the meat doesn't have me'ilah because that's designated. I wrote Kohanim. It should actually be either for Kohanim or for individuals. I'll correct that, but that was a mistake in the chart. And the fats that are offered on the altar do have me'ilah because they're designated for the altar. And for Kodshei Kodashim, it all depends what happens. For the Olah, it all goes on the altar, it all has me'ilah. For the Chatat and the Asham, the parts that are eaten by Kohanim don't have me'ilah because they're designated for human beings. Doesn't matter that they represent God. It's designated for human beings. That means that there is no me'ilah. It's not all for God. But the fats do have me'ilah. That's the basis, okay? How that's applied in Perek Zayin Mishnah Daled, we won't have time for. I will try to build my shiur next time around for next week in such a way that we'll be able to spend a few minutes on Mishnah Daled of Perek Zayin as well. And we also have the main part of Perek Chet that we didn't get to today, but Bezrat Hashem, we will fill in next time. So, Erev Tov and Shavua Tov to all.
All right. And Erev Tov, Shavua Tov. Thank you all for joining for this
Thank you.
material-packed class. I have two updates for everyone. First, please keep an eye on the course page for Mishnah Zevachim. We've had some changes to the schedule. Next week on August 17th will be our last live class in person. Due to some conflicting schedules, Rabbi Walfish will not be teaching live on the 24th and the 31st, but video sharing will go out and be available to enrolled students and then later to the public. And I also want to let people know, Elul Zman classes are open for registration. You can check out our offerings at drisha.org/classes, including more Mishnah in depth and a new Gemara shiur Daf Shvui with Rabbi Joshua Kolb. We hope to see you in Elul for more learning. Take care, everyone, and be well.